Chapter 20. Aisha. After weeks in Medine, Aisha was glad to be back in the desert. She was not, however, glad to be here with the present company. She was accompanied to working alone, or on rare occasion with Omar or another thief. Camping with near strangers was exasperating. She grumbled to herself as she leaned over the campfire. Things could be worse, she supposed. At least the bodyguard and the merchant weren't inept. On the contrary, Kadir was good with a bow, and Lily knew how to skin and cook the game he'd brought back. For the last 3 days, since they'd left Medine, they had helped set up camp and chart their way to Dime. All in all, Aisha could admit that they had been decent traveling companions. And then there was Prince Mazen. Though he was familiar enough with Omar's mannerisms to be a decent actor, he was dead weight. All she had managed to teach him so far was how to make a fire. Every other task she handled by herself. It would not have been so terrible, she thought, if she hadn't been pretending to serve a man who was not her king. Aisha plucked a branch from the edges of the fire and absently began to draw shapes in the sand. It was not until Luli al-Nazari joined her and glanced at the lines that Aisha realized she was scratching flowers into the dirt. She brushed them away with feigned nonchalance. The merchant pulled her knees to her chest. "Hobby of yours?" she asked. "None of your business," Aisha said. "Not one for talk, are you? Speak for yourself. Do not pretend you have not been avoiding us." The merchant shrugged as she leaned closer to the fire. "And you've been avoiding us." No sooner had she begun to warm her hands than a gust of wind rushed through, unsettling the sand and making the flame flicker. The merchant flinched back. Aisha suppressed a shudder as she pulled up her hood. It always took a few nights to acclimate to the harsher winds when she returned to the desert. Footsteps sounded behind them, and moments later Prince Mazen and Kadir appeared. The prince with the map she'd insisted he study, and Kadir with a bag of dates he'd apparently purchased at the oasis 2 days ago. Mazen seated himself a few feet away, while Kadir settled himself beside the merchant. She shifted closer to him, close enough to steal the bag of dates off his lap. Kadir didn't seem to mind when she started munching on them. "I see there's been a shift in the weather," he said. Mazen smirked. It was a disconcertingly perfect mirror image of Omar's usual smile. What an astute observation. Aisha glanced up at the sky. The full moon looked hazy, almost like a mirage. She saw no encroaching clouds, so it was unlikely a rainstorm was coming. What then? Was the bodyguard just referring to the colder winds? That was not unusual for this time of year. It is hardly noteworthy. She returned her gaze to the merchant, who looked like she was fighting a chill with her arms crossed beneath her cloak. Kadir, on the other hand, appeared perfectly unperturbed by the cold, and Prince Mazen, Aisha could tell by the way he clenched his jaw that he was trying to keep his teeth from chattering. "Shift or no shift, we'll arrive at Dime tomorrow," he said. "We will not have to fear for the weather being a hindrance when we are within city walls." The merchant raised a brow. "What an astute observation, High Prince." Mazen blinked, looking stupefied. Aisha pointedly cleared her throat and diverted the conversation. "Do not forget about the Wali of Dime, Saidi. He will be expecting us to pay him a visit when we arrive in the city. Omar never passed through Dime without visiting the city's guardian." It was a small reassurance that Mazen would already know Ahmed's demeanor. Mazen was a prince after all, and he'd doubtless met the Wali when he visited Medina on business. The prince sighed. "Of course, I could never forget Ahmed. He's too dramatic for that." Luli al-Nazari flinched. It was a slight motion, but noticeable, given her silence. She knows him, Aisha thought. But her curiosity sparked and died in the same breath. She could not read the merchant's feelings on her face, and she did not care enough to pry. Silence encompassed the area. They all stared solemnly, quietly into the fire, and then when the merchant threw a stray stick into the blaze, the flames crackled and flared, painting her face with shadows that made her scornful gaze look even harsher. "Well," she said, "where the weather is concerned, I suppose there's nothing to do but wait and see what tomorrow brings." The next day brought a goddamn dust storm. Tenacious winds cleaved the landscape, and harsh gusts tore at their clothing and whipped at their skin. One needed only to glimpse at the eerie orange sky to know they were in the middle of a sandstorm. The city of Dime, which ought to have been a few hours away, was nothing but a blurry shape barely visible beyond clouds of dust. The single indication they were going in the right direction was the merchant's compass, which dutifully pointed north. Or so Aisha assumed. The merchant and her taciturn bodyguard had disappeared into the haze, and she could no longer see them. The wind howled in her ears, throwing so much dust in her face she had to conceal it behind her scarves. She cursed at the world collapsed into sand and wind and gloom. The sand was there even when she squeezed her eyes shut, sticking to her lashes and prickling the backs of her lids. It was in her throat, turning every exhale into painful wheezing cough. She wanted to kick herself for not realizing the foggy sky had been a precursor to this. She had foolishly expected tamer traveling weather because it was the beginning of the cold season, but she ought to have known by now that desert weather was a fickle thing. She chanced to look at her surroundings as the wind shriek died into a mournful moan, squinting into the dust for any sign of human motion. The midnight merchant was still absent from sight, but Aisha could see another figure approaching. His face was covered, but she would have recognized Omar anywhere, even when he was not himself. Aisha urged her mare toward the prince, closer and closer, until the wind picked up again and a thick curtain of dust descended upon him. Her vision went black. Time ceased to exist in the darkness. It was useless to push forward, so Aisha gripped her reins, ducked her face into her scarves, and retreated into the calm of her mind. The wind battered her so heavily from every side that she soon lost all sense of direction. She simultaneously felt as if she had been flung into the air, and also like she was being buried. It became difficult, nearly impossible, to breathe. Only one thought kept her anchored to her saddle: I will not be bested by a storm. Long minutes passed, and she repeated the words over and over again until eventually the wind abated and the sky lightened to dim red. Taking advantage of the break in the storm, she pulled down the cloth covering her stinging eyes and looked up. Sand trailed down her cheeks like tears as she examined the desert. The landscape was empty. No prince, no merchant, no bodyguard. Nothing but sand. The dread hit suddenly with the force of a punch to the stomach. Aisha keeled over in her saddle. She clenched her reins with trembling hands. Omar had given her the single, simple job. If she confessed to him that she had lost his brother simply because she'd underestimated the storm and hadn't taken the proper precautions, that she hadn't even bothered to rope their horses together, no, she bit her cheek hard. Self-pity is for failures. She would find the prince. It was her mission to protect him, and she would not fail. She focused on her breathing, exhaling slowly and deeply into her scarf to settle her thundering heart. The merchant and her bodyguard had been heading north, probably towards some kind of shelter. If she could find a way to reorient herself in that direction. Aisha! The call was barely a murmur, but Aisha could still discern the direction it was coming from. Her heart simultaneously leapt and sank with relief when she turned in her saddle and saw the shadow of the prince waving at her from a distance. She waved back, one curt motion to let him know she saw him. The prince raised his hand and pointed east. Aisha veered left, mirroring the progress from afar as she worked to close the gap between them. But it was a sizable distance, and the wind was beginning to pick up again, bringing with it a thick layer of sand that made it difficult to tell whether he was miles or feet away. In this visibility, she couldn't even see his face. Aisha leashed her frustration and focused on her progress. Never mind that there was sand in every crevice of her body, or that every one of her breaths was a rasp because there was so much of it in her lungs. Never mind that the wind was unraveling her shawls, and that its howl had softened into a whisper that sounded oddly like a voice. Ya Alasha, that glower will stick to your face if you don't lighten up. Aisha tensed, unbidden. Her eyes wandered to the smear of color at the edge of her vision. She inhaled sharply at the impossible sight before her. A man, standing in the middle of a storm, waving at her with a crooked smile on his face. But, no, she was mistaken. There was no storm. There was only her brother, standing in the field of Samish, teasing her because he knew it was the best way to spark her motivation. I know you, dear sister. Deny it all you like, but I know that it is spite that best fuels you." The longer she stared, the clearer her brother's visage became. The angular face, the dark eyes, the stubble he had never had the chance to grow into a beard. A door slammed shut in Aisha's mind, and her brother suddenly vanished. She tightened her grip on her reins and thought, "The dead do not speak." Normally, being self-aware was enough to overcome the heat-induced hallucinations of the desert, but these mirages were just as persistent as the storm. Every time Aisha turned away from one, another materialized before her eyes. She saw her mother beckoning to her from beneath a date tree as she worked on one of her baskets. She saw her uncle leading a herd of sheep to pasture. Aisha dug her nails into her palms hard enough to make the skin tear. "The dead do not speak," she murmured to herself. "The dead do not speak. How curious that you can silence their voices." She whirled, and suddenly there was her brother, inexplicably riding beside her on the prince's horse. No, not the prince's. The shadow she had thought was Mazen was not him at all. "Tell me, killer, does it ease your conscience to silence your victims?" The phantom's eyes darkened with his smirk, the pupils bleeding into the whites until they were black as coal. "Typical hunter, thinking you are above death." Jinn magic. The epiphany burned through Aisha like fire. She moved on instinct, sliding the knife from her sleeve and throwing it at her brother's face. The mirage had been her flesh and blood, crumbled to dust, and the horse vanished with it, but Aisha was no longer alone. Beneath the layers of wind and dust she could make out a dune, and at the top of the dune was a lone, grinning shadow. "Find me, Jinn killer," it whispered in her mind. Aisha's possession-resisting rings burned. It was all she could do to keep from prying them off. She knew she could turn around, that she should find the prince again. Trying to fight in this storm was madness, and the Jinn was clearly taunting her. But this creature had looked into her mind. It had thought to fool her, and Aisha refused to be deceived by a Jinn. A deadly calm washed over her as she spurred her mare forward. She would deal with this monster and its illusions, and then she would resume her search for the group. It would not take long to dispatch the creature. She had faced many like it before. The shadow never moved, just stood there, smiling at her from a distance. "Find me," it whispered. "Find me, find me." By the time Aisha had dismounted, the voice was a relentless jeer, urging her onward and making her vision beat red with rage. Aisha climbed the dune, even with the wind battered her from every direction, and her world descended once more into darkness. She climbed. She pressed her lips together, sand crunched beneath her teeth, and put one heavy foot in front of the other, over and over and over again, until her heel met air. There was a moment of suspension, and then Aisha stumbled, gracelessly sliding down the slope of sand on nerveless legs. One of her scarves flew loose, and by the time she'd reached the bottom of the dune, her throat was so full of sand she could barely breathe. Irritated and shaken, Aisha cursed as she reached for her blades. She was relieved to feel both still sheathed at her hips. Good. Her eyes were burning and her body was sore, but at least she had her weapons. She wrapped her fingers around the hilts as she squinted into the dust. That was when she saw the chasm, an ominous darkness partially hidden behind a curtain of sparkling sand. Aisha threw a look over her shoulder at the desert. The storm still raged behind her, vicious and blinding and relentless, just as impenetrable as the void before her. Aisha knew a trap when she saw one. The Jinn had orchestrated this so that, regardless of which way she turned, she would be lost. "Find me." The taunt echoing from the darkness had a cadence of a song. She faced the gloom with a glare. She had no way of knowing if the Jinn was the cause of the sandstorm, but it didn't matter. It was her job to exterminate these creatures. What kind of hunter would she be if she let this monster escape to wreak havoc on unsuspecting travelers? She would deal with the Jinn first, then she would find the group. Simple. Aisha stepped forward. "Prepare yourself, Jinn." She began the hunt.